Marcus Chen wiped the grease from his hands as he finished repairing the atmospheric processor in Sector 7 of the mining colony. The red dust of Kepler 442b swirled outside the reinforced windows, and he could hear the distant rumble of the mining equipment working through the night shift. At 25, he had already spent 3 years on this godforsaken rock, fixing machines that seemed determined to break down in the harsh alien environment. The emergency beacon started screaming just as he was packing up his tools. Marcus grabbed his scanner and followed the signal through the maze of industrial corridors. The beacon led him to the outer perimeter, near the waste disposal area where few people ventured after dark. What he found there changed everything. A small figure lay crumpled against a pile of discarded metal sheeting. At first, Marcus thought it was a child from the colony, maybe injured in an accident. But as he knelt down and activated his portable light, his breath caught in his throat. The girl couldn't have been more than 12 years old, but her skin was a deep blue color that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light. Strange markings covered her arms like natural tattoos, and her hair was white as starlight. She was barely breathing, her small chest rising and falling in irregular patterns. Blood seeped from wounds on her side, but the blood itself was silver, not red. Marcus had never seen anything like her in his life. His first instinct was to call the colony security, but something stopped him. The way she was dressed in torn, unfamiliar clothing suggested she wasn't from any known human settlement. She was alien, and if the corporate authorities got their hands on her, she would probably end up in a laboratory. Marcus made a decision that would haunt and define the rest of his life. He gathered the unconscious girl in his arms, surprised by how light she was, and carried her back to his small quarters in the worker housing block. The corridors were empty at this hour, and he managed to slip inside without being seen. His quarters were cramped but private, consisting of a main room with a fold-out bed, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. Marcus laid the blue girl on his bed and examined her injuries more closely. The wounds appeared to be from some kind of energy weapon, burns that cut deep into her alien flesh. He had basic medical training from his mining certification, but this was far beyond anything in the manual. Working carefully with the limited supplies from his first aid kit, Marcus cleaned the wounds and applied synthetic skin patches. The girl's body temperature was lower than human normal, and her pulse had a different rhythm, but she seemed stable. As he worked, he noticed that her markings weren't tattoos at all, but seemed to be part of her natural skin pattern, like the stripes on a zebra or the spots on a leopard. For 3 days, Marcus cared for the mysterious girl while maintaining his regular work schedule. He told his supervisor he was fighting off a minor virus to explain why he looked tired and distracted. During his shifts, his mind wandered constantly to the small alien lying in his bed. He brought her water and tried feeding her small amounts of nutrient paste, but she remained unconscious. On the 4th day, she finally opened her eyes. They were large and violet, with an intelligence that seemed far older than her apparent age. She didn't speak at first, just watched Marcus with careful attention as he moved around the room. When he offered her water, she accepted it gratefully, and when he showed her the food, she ate slowly but steadily. Communication proved challenging. She didn't understand English, and Marcus certainly didn't know her language. But over the following weeks, they developed a system of gestures and simple words. She was quick to learn, picking up basic English phrases with remarkable speed. Her name, as near as Marcus could pronounce it, was something like Ziara. Ziara was curious about everything in Marcus's quarters. She examined his tools, his data pad, even his clothing with the intense focus of a scientist. Sometimes she would touch objects and close her eyes as if she could sense things about them that Marcus couldn't understand. She was particularly fascinated by his music collection, listening for hours to everything from classical symphonies to heavy metal rock. As the weeks passed, Marcus learned that Ziara was not just intelligent but brilliant. She began to understand the colony's technology almost intuitively, grasping concepts that had taken Marcus months to learn. When she saw his technical manuals, she absorbed the information like a sponge, pointing out inefficiencies in the mining equipment designs that Marcus had never noticed. But Ziara also carried a deep sadness that Marcus could see in her violet eyes. Sometimes she would stare out the small window at the alien stars, and tears would run down her blue cheeks. She tried to explain what had happened to her, but her limited English and his complete ignorance of her background made it impossible to understand the full story. All Marcus could gather was that she had been running from something terrible when she collapsed near the colony. The longer Ziara stayed with him, the more Marcus realized he was walking a dangerous line. Hiding an alien from the corporate authorities was a crime that would result in immediate termination and probably imprisonment. But every day she smiled at him, every small joke they shared despite the language barrier, every moment of wonder in her eyes when she discovered something new about human culture made the risk seem worthwhile. Marcus had always been a loner, someone who kept his head down and did his job without getting involved in other people's problems. But this strange blue girl had awakened something in him he didn't know existed. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something that truly mattered, something more important than fixing machines and earning credits. As Ziara's English improved, she began to tell Marcus fragments of her story. She spoke of a great war among the stars, of her people being hunted by an enemy so terrible that she couldn't bring herself to name them. She had escaped in a small ship, but it had been damaged and crashed somewhere in the outer system. The emergency beacon that led Marcus to her had been her last hope. Marcus listened to these stories with growing unease. If Ziara was telling the truth, then harboring her might bring danger not just to himself, but to the entire colony. But when he looked at this brilliant, brave young being who had lost everything and everyone she had ever known, he couldn't bring himself to abandon her. The decision to help her find a way off-world was inevitable, even though Marcus had no idea how to accomplish such a thing. 2 months after finding Ziara, Marcus had developed a routine that kept both of them safe while she recovered and learned about human society. He would leave for his maintenance shifts each morning, locking his quarters from the inside so Ziara could move around freely without anyone discovering her. She spent her days studying his technical manuals and watching educational videos on his datapad, absorbing human knowledge with frightening speed. The breakthrough came when Ziara figured out how to access the colony's main computer network through Marcus's personal terminal. Her people's technology was apparently far more advanced than anything humans had developed, and she understood computer systems in ways that seemed almost magical to Marcus. Within days, she had mapped the entire colony's infrastructure and identified several critical flaws in their defense systems. Marcus returned from work one evening to find Ziara hunched over his terminal, her violet eyes reflecting the screen's glow as lines of code scrolled past faster than any human could read. She had somehow accessed classified files about the colony's purpose, files that Marcus, with his basic security clearance, had never seen. What she showed him made his blood run cold. The mining operation was just a cover story. Kepler 442b was actually a strategic military outpost designed to monitor deep space for signs of alien activity. The corporate executives weren't just interested in the planet's mineral resources. They were preparing for a war they expected to come from the stars. Hidden beneath the mining equipment were weapon systems powerful enough to destroy approaching spacecraft, and the colony's true population was 3 times larger than Marcus had believed, with most of the residents being soldiers in disguise. Ziara explained all of this to Marcus in her improving English, her small hands gesturing at the tactical displays she had uncovered. The humans were preparing to fight her people, though they didn't even know what her people looked like or where they came from. The corporate authorities had evidence of alien technology somewhere in the galaxy and had decided that the best defense was a preemptive strike. This revelation forced Marcus to confront an uncomfortable truth. By helping Ziara, he wasn't just risking his own career and freedom. He was potentially betraying his own species. But as he looked at this brilliant, kind young being who had never shown anything but curiosity and gratitude toward humans, he couldn't bring himself to see her as an enemy. Ziara seemed to sense his internal conflict. She spent several days teaching him about her people, the Corvani, using drawings and simple explanations to help him understand their culture. The Corvani were explorers and scientists, she explained, who had been traveling among the stars for thousands of years. They had never conquered other worlds or enslaved other species. Instead, they sought to learn and to help younger civilizations develop peacefully. The enemy that had driven Ziara from her home wasn't another alien race at all. It was a faction of Corvani who had turned to violence and conquest, calling themselves the Dominion. They believed that advanced species had the right to rule over primitive ones, and they had started a civil war that was tearing Corvani civilization apart. Ziara's family had been part of the resistance, fighting to preserve their people's peaceful traditions. Marcus began to understand that Ziara wasn't just a refugee from some distant war. She was carrying information that could help humanity distinguish between the peaceful Corvani and their violent cousins. The corporate authorities were preparing to fight an enemy they didn't understand, and their aggressive stance might actually drive the peaceful Corvani into the arms of the Dominion. The more Marcus learned about the situation, the more he realized that he and Ziara needed to escape the colony. She couldn't stay hidden forever, and when she was eventually discovered, the corporate response would be swift and brutal. But getting off-world required resources and connections that a simple maintenance worker didn't possess. That's when Ziara surprised him again. Using her access to the colony's computer systems, she had identified several transport ships that made regular runs between Kepler 442b and the inner colonies. More importantly, she had figured out how to modify their manifest systems to create false identities for both of them. With her help, they could board a cargo transport as legitimate passengers and disappear into the vast network of human settlements. The plan required careful timing and no small amount of luck. Ziara would need to disguise her alien appearance, which she accomplished using a combination of makeup, colored contact lenses, and clothing that covered her distinctive markings. The result wasn't perfect, but in the dim lighting of a cargo transport, she might pass for a human child with an unusual skin condition. Marcus used his technical skills to create forged maintenance orders that would give him legitimate reasons to be near the transport docks during the next scheduled departure. Ziara would meet him there, posing as his younger sister who was being transferred to a medical facility in the inner colonies for treatment of her rare genetic disorder. The night before their planned escape, Ziara showed Marcus something that changed his entire perspective on their situation. She had been working on a small device using components salvaged from his repair equipment, and when she activated it, a three-dimensional hologram appeared in the air above his desk. The image showed a map of the local stellar region, with dozens of star systems marked in different colors. Red markers indicated systems controlled by the Dominion, while blue ones showed areas still under the control of peaceful Corvani. What Marcus saw made him gasp in shock. The Dominion had already conquered more than half of known Corvani space, and their expansion was heading directly toward human territory. The corporate authorities weren't being paranoid. Humanity really was about to face an invasion by a technologically superior enemy. But Ziara's map also showed something else. There were green markers scattered throughout the region, indicating Corvani resistance bases that were still fighting against the Dominion. If humanity could make contact with these resistance groups, they might be able to form an alliance against their common enemy. Ziara herself carried communication codes that could open diplomatic channels with the resistance leadership. Marcus realized that their escape from the colony wasn't just about saving Ziara's life or his own career. They were carrying information that could determine the outcome of an interstellar war. The peaceful first contact between humans and Corvani that Ziara represented might be humanity's only chance to avoid conquest by the Dominion. As they made their final preparations for departure, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just a maintenance worker trying to help a lost child. He had somehow become a key figure in the first diplomatic contact between two species, and the decisions he made in the coming days could affect the fate of both civilizations. The transport ship Industrial Pioneer was scheduled to depart at dawn, carrying a cargo of refined metals to the manufacturing centers of the inner colonies. Marcus and Ziara would be among the handful of passengers making the 3-week journey to New Geneva, where they hoped to find someone willing to listen to their impossible story. Neither of them slept that last night on Kepler 442b. They spent the hours checking and rechecking their preparations, knowing that if anything went wrong during their escape, it would mean death for Ziara and a lifetime in prison for Marcus. But as the alien sun began to rise over the red desert outside his window, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he was doing something that truly mattered. The escape from Kepler 442b went more smoothly than Marcus had dared to hope. Ziara's disguise held up under casual inspection, and the forged documentation she had created passed through 3 different security checkpoints without raising any alarms. The cargo transport industrial pioneer lifted off exactly on schedule, carrying them away from the red planet toward the heart of human space. During the 3-week journey to New Geneva, Marcus and Ziara refined their story and planned their next moves. Ziara's English had improved dramatically, and she could now pass for a human teenager with only minor speech patterns giving away her alien origin. She had also been studying human politics and social structures, preparing herself for the complex negotiations that lay ahead. The challenge they faced was enormous. How do you convince the leaders of human civilization that peaceful aliens exist and want to form an alliance, especially when those same leaders are preparing for an alien invasion? Marcus had no political connections or scientific credentials that would give him credibility with government officials. He was just a maintenance worker with an incredible story and an alien companion who looked like a blue-skinned human child. Ziara suggested they start with the scientific community rather than politicians. Her knowledge of advanced physics and computer systems could serve as proof of her alien origin, and scientists might be more willing to listen to evidence than career politicians who were focused on military preparations. She had been working on mathematical proofs that demonstrated principles unknown to human science, concepts that could revolutionize human technology if properly understood. New Geneva was one of the oldest and most established colonies in human space, home to the prestigious Colonial Research Institute and several major universities. If they could get the attention of prominent scientists there, those academics might be able to open doors to higher levels of government and military leadership. The plan seemed reasonable until they actually arrived at New Geneva and discovered that the colony was under martial law. The corporate authorities had apparently decided that the alien threat was imminent, and military forces were taking control of all major population centers. Armed soldiers patrolled the streets and civilian movements were heavily restricted. Presenting themselves to the scientific community would be impossible under these conditions. Marcus and Ziara found themselves trapped in a cheap hotel near the spaceport, watching news reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of humanity's preparations for war. The corporate military was mobilizing fleets and calling up reserves from across human space. Scientists who had previously advocated for peaceful contact with alien civilizations were being arrested as potential security risks. The situation grew worse when they learned that the corporate authorities had discovered Ziara's disappearance from Kepler 442b. Security footage from the transport had been analyzed, and enhanced imaging had revealed inconsistencies in Ziara's disguise. Alerts were being broadcast across the colonial network, describing Marcus as a traitor who had kidnapped an alien prisoner, and warning that both of them were extremely dangerous. With their faces now known to every security system in human space, traditional approaches to making contact became impossible. They couldn't walk into a university or government building without being arrested immediately. But Ziara had anticipated this possibility, and had been working on alternative plans using her advanced understanding of human computer networks. She explained to Marcus that she could use the colony's communication systems to send a message directly to the Corvani resistance, calling for a diplomatic mission to make official contact with humanity. The message would include mathematical proofs of her identity and her location, allowing the resistance to send a delegation to New Geneva within a few weeks. The corporate authorities would have to listen when faced with an actual alien diplomatic mission. The plan required Ziara to access the colony's main communication array, which was heavily guarded and located in the restricted military zone. But she had been studying the facility's blueprints and security protocols, and she believed she could reach the equipment without being detected. Her Corvani technology gave her advantages that human security systems weren't designed to handle. Marcus was horrified by the idea of Ziara taking such a risk, but she convinced him that it was their only remaining option. Every day they waited, the corporate military grew stronger and more committed to their aggressive stance. If the first contact between humans and Corvani was a military engagement, rather than a diplomatic meeting, it would doom any chance of peaceful cooperation. They spent several days planning the infiltration, with Ziara using her computer access to map patrol routes and identify security vulnerabilities. The communication array was located in a fortified compound on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by energy barriers and automated defense systems. But there was a maintenance access tunnel that connected to the main sewage system, and Ziara believed she could use that route to reach the equipment undetected. The night of the mission, Marcus felt sick with worry as he watched Ziara disappear into the tunnel entrance. She carried a small device of her own construction, built from components they had purchased in the colony's electronics market. If everything went according to plan, she would be able to send her message and return within 2 hours. If something went wrong, Marcus might never see her again. The waiting was agony. Marcus monitored police communications on a portable scanner, listening for any sign that Ziara had been discovered. He had prepared emergency supplies and transportation in case they needed to flee the colony immediately. But he knew that without Ziara's technical skills, he would never be able to evade capture for long. After what felt like an eternity, Ziara reappeared at the tunnel entrance, her disguise torn and dirty but her violet eyes bright with triumph. She had successfully accessed the communication array and transmitted her message to the resistance. More importantly, she had received a response. A Corvani diplomatic ship was already en route to New Geneva and would arrive within the week. But their celebration was short-lived. Within hours of Ziara's infiltration, the corporate military discovered evidence of the security breach. They didn't know exactly what had been accessed, but they knew that someone with advanced technical skills had penetrated their most secure facility. The entire colony was placed under lockdown, with security forces conducting building-by-building searches for the infiltrators. Marcus and Ziara were forced to abandon their hotel and take refuge in the colony's underground maintenance tunnels. The same system Ziara had used to reach the communication array. It was a harsh environment, cold and damp with barely enough space to lie down. But it was also the one place where Ziara's knowledge of the colony's infrastructure gave them a significant advantage. Living in the tunnels, they became like ghosts, haunting the colony's foundations. Ziara used her access to the utility systems to monitor security communications and track the movements of their pursuers. She also began making subtle modifications to the colony's infrastructure, preparing surprises that would help them evade capture when the situation became desperate. As they waited for the Corvani diplomatic mission to arrive, Marcus began to understand just how much Ziara had changed during their time together. The frightened, injured child he had rescued on Kepler 442b had grown into a brilliant and determined young leader. She spoke of her responsibility to both their peoples with a maturity that made Marcus feel like the child in their relationship. The week passed slowly, with close calls and narrow escapes as security forces came closer to discovering their hiding place. But Ziara's modifications to the colony's systems proved their worth, creating false readings and misdirecting search teams. She had essentially turned the entire infrastructure of New Geneva into a tool for their protection. On the 7th day, long-range sensors detected an approaching spacecraft of unknown design. The corporate military immediately went to full alert, mobilizing their defensive fleet and preparing for battle. But the alien ship transmitted Ziara's authentication codes and requested permission to land for diplomatic discussions. Marcus and Ziara watched the events unfold from a hidden chamber near the spaceport, listening to increasingly frantic communications between military commanders who had no idea how to respond to an actual alien diplomatic mission. They had spent months preparing for war, but no one had seriously planned for the possibility of peaceful contact. The Corvani ship landed despite the corporate military's obvious reluctance, and a small delegation emerged to begin humanity's first official contact with an alien civilization. But Marcus knew that the real work was just beginning. The Corvani diplomatic ship was unlike anything humans had ever seen. Its hull seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, and it landed without any visible propulsion system, settling onto the designated pad as gently as a falling feather. The corporate military maintained a respectful distance but kept their weapons trained on the alien vessel, ready to respond to any sign of aggression. From their hidden observation post, Marcus and Ziara watched as the ship's entrance opened with a sound like singing crystal. 3 Corvani emerged, their blue skin and elegant bearing immediately identifying them as members of Ziara's species. But these were clearly adults, tall and graceful, wearing clothing that seemed to be woven from starlight itself. The lead diplomat carried a staff topped with a crystal that pulsed with soft light, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the spaceport despite the distance. The Corvani delegation was met by a hastily assembled group of human officials, including the colonial governor, military commanders, and a few scientists who had been deemed politically reliable. The meeting took place in a secure conference facility near the spaceport, with the entire proceedings being monitored by hidden cameras and recording devices. Ziara used her technical skills to tap into these surveillance feeds, allowing her and Marcus to witness humanity's first diplomatic contact with an alien civilization. The lead Corvani diplomat, who introduced herself as Ambassador Thane Coraval, spoke flawless English and demonstrated an impressive understanding of human culture and politics. She had clearly done her homework before arriving at New Geneva. Ambassador Coraval began by explaining the broader galactic situation, confirming everything that Ziara had told Marcus about the civil war among her people. The Dominion had indeed conquered much of Corvani space and was expanding toward human territory. But she also brought disturbing news that was worse than anything Ziara had known when she escaped her homeworld months. Earlier, the Dominion had captured several Corvani research facilities that contained detailed information about human civilization. They knew about human technology, military capabilities, and population centers. More importantly, they had decided that humanity represented a potential threat that needed to be eliminated before it could develop into a serious rival. The invasion fleet was already being assembled and would reach human space within 2 years. This revelation sent shockwaves through the human delegation. The corporate military had been preparing for a possible alien contact, but they had assumed they would have years to build up their defenses. Learning that a vastly superior enemy was already on the way forced them to completely reconsider their strategic position. Ambassador Coraval offered humanity a lifeline. The Corvani resistance was willing to share advanced technology and military knowledge in exchange for human assistance in their fight against the Dominion. Human manufacturing capabilities and resource extraction methods could provide the resistance with advantages they desperately needed, while Corvani science could give humanity the tools to defend itself effectively. But the proposed alliance came with conditions that the human officials found difficult to accept. The Corvani insisted that all cooperation must be based on peaceful principles, with no offensive weapons or conquest technologies being shared. They also demanded the right to establish monitoring stations throughout human space to ensure that any advanced technology they provided wouldn't be used for aggressive purposes. The human military commanders were skeptical of these restrictions. They wanted access to Corvani weapons technology and the ability to launch preemptive strikes against Dominion forces. The idea of accepting alien monitoring of human activities was particularly offensive to officials who had spent their careers maintaining human independence and security. As the negotiations continued over several days, it became clear that both sides were struggling to overcome fundamental differences in their approaches to conflict and cooperation. The humans were accustomed to hierarchical military structures and decisive action, while the Corvani preferred consensus building and long-term planning. Each side found the other's methods frustrating and inefficient. Ziara grew increasingly agitated as she watched the talks stall over political and cultural differences. She knew that time was running out, and that every day wasted in negotiations brought the Dominion invasion closer. Finally, she made a decision that terrified Marcus but demonstrated the courage and leadership that had been growing within her during their months together. Against Marcus's desperate protests, Ziara decided to reveal herself to both delegations. She had been in contact with Ambassador Coraval through secure channels, using communication methods that the human monitoring systems couldn't detect. The ambassador had been searching for her ever since receiving her message, and Ziara's presence at the negotiations could provide the personal connection needed to bridge the gap between the two species. The plan required careful timing and absolute trust in Ambassador Coraval's ability to protect them from the human military response. Ziara would emerge from hiding during a critical moment in the negotiations, when the talks were on the verge of collapse. Her presence as a living example of peaceful human Corvani cooperation might be enough to convince both sides to overcome their differences. Marcus knew he couldn't stop Ziara from taking this risk, but he also couldn't let her face it alone. If she was going to reveal herself to both governments, he would stand beside her and accept whatever consequences followed. They had come too far together to be separated now, especially when the fate of both their civilizations hung in the balance. The opportunity came during the 4th day of negotiations, when the human delegation was preparing to reject the Corvani proposals and demand more favorable terms. Ambassador Corrival had just explained that the resistance couldn't provide offensive weapons technology under any circumstances, and the human military commanders were threatening to end the talks entirely. That's when Ziara and Marcus emerged from the maintenance tunnels beneath the conference facility, walking calmly into the most heavily guarded and monitored location on New Geneva. The security systems immediately detected their presence, but Ziara had timed their appearance perfectly. By the time security forces could respond, they were already in the conference room, standing before the startled representatives of two civilizations. The human officials recognized Marcus immediately from the security alerts that had been circulating for weeks. But their attention was quickly drawn to Ziara, whose alien appearance was unmistakable despite her disguise. The fact that she was clearly a child made her presence even more shocking, and forced both sides to reconsider their assumptions about each other. Ambassador Corrival's reaction confirmed that she had been expecting Ziara's arrival. The older Corvani diplomat immediately rose from her seat and approached Ziara with obvious relief and joy, speaking in their musical native language before switching to English for the benefit of the human observers. Ziara's introduction of herself to the human delegation was simple but powerful. She explained how Marcus had saved her life and cared for her for months, demonstrating the best qualities of human compassion and courage. She also described her own studies of human civilization and her growing respect for human innovation and determination. But most importantly, Ziara offered herself as proof that cooperation between the two species was not only possible, but natural. She had lived among humans, learned their language and customs, and found them to be honorable and trustworthy allies. If a young Corvani refugee could adapt to human society so successfully, then surely their governments could find ways to work together. The presence of Ziara and Marcus in the conference room transformed the entire dynamic of the negotiations. Here was living proof that humans and Corvani could not only coexist, but actually care for and protect each other. The abstract discussions about alliance terms suddenly became personal and immediate. The human officials were particularly impressed by Marcus's sacrifice in protecting Ziara, risking his career and freedom to help an alien child. His actions embodied the best of human values and demonstrated that humanity was ready for peaceful contact with other species. The fact that he was a simple maintenance worker rather than a trained diplomat made his courage even more meaningful. Ambassador Corrival used this breakthrough to push for rapid progress in the negotiations. With Ziara's living example of human Corvani friendship, she was able to convince her human counterparts that the restrictions on technology sharing were necessary safeguards rather than insults to human integrity. The monitoring stations could be joint operations, with human and Corvani personnel working together to ensure mutual security. By the end of the day, the framework for a formal alliance had been established. Humanity would provide manufacturing capacity and raw materials to support the Corvani resistance, while the Corvani would share defensive technologies and scientific knowledge to help humanity prepare for the coming invasion. Most importantly, both sides committed to treating this as a partnership between equals rather than a patron-client relationship. The months following the initial alliance agreement were a whirlwind of activity that transformed both human and Corvani societies. Joint research facilities were established throughout human space, where scientists from both species worked together to develop new technologies and defensive systems. The cultural exchange programs that emerged from these collaborations proved to be just as valuable as the scientific cooperation. Marcus found himself thrust into a role he had never expected or wanted. The corporate and military leadership had pardoned his earlier actions and now treated him as an expert on human Corvani relations. He was assigned to the Joint Coordination Committee that oversaw the alliance projects, working alongside some of the most brilliant minds from both civilizations. But it was Ziara who truly flourished in this new environment. Her unique perspective as someone who understood both species intimately made her invaluable to the alliance effort. Despite her apparent youth, she was appointed as a special cultural advisor and liaison, helping to bridge the communication gaps that still arose between human and Corvani team members. The technology sharing program exceeded everyone's expectations. Corvani advances in energy manipulation and materials science revolutionized human manufacturing, while human expertise in mass production and resource management solved logistical problems that had been limiting the Resistance's effectiveness. The first joint design starships rolled off the production lines within 6 months. Vessels that combined the best of both species' engineering traditions. More importantly, the defensive preparations for the anticipated Dominion invasion were proceeding ahead of schedule. The new shield generators based on Corvani technology could protect entire planets from energy weapons, while human-designed automated defense platforms provided the firepower needed to engage enemy fleets. For the first time since learning about the Dominion threat, humanity had reason to be optimistic about its chances of survival. But the Alliance faced challenges that went beyond technology and military preparation. Many humans remained suspicious of their alien partners, fearing that the Corvani would eventually reveal themselves to be another threat to human independence. Some religious groups declared that contact with aliens was a violation of divine will, while political factions argued that humanity was surrendering its sovereignty to foreign powers. The Corvani had their own concerns about working with humans. Some resistance leaders worried that human aggression and territorial instincts would eventually drag the Corvani into conflicts they wanted to avoid. There were also philosophical disagreements about the use of violence even in self-defense that created tension between Corvani pacifist traditions and human military pragmatism. Ziara and Marcus found themselves at the center of these cultural conflicts, serving as living examples of successful cooperation, while also bearing the burden of representing their entire species to skeptical observers. The pressure was enormous, especially for Ziara, who was still technically a child. Despite her advanced intellectual development and growing political responsibilities, the situation became more complicated when other Corvani refugees began arriving in human space, fleeing the expanding Dominion conquest. Each new arrival brought fresh stories of horror from the war zones, describing entire star systems being enslaved or destroyed by Dominion forces. These refugees also brought disturbing news about the invasion timeline. The Dominion fleet was moving faster than expected and might reach human territory within 18 months rather than 2 years. Among the new arrivals was someone who changed everything for Ziara. Elder Tavish Kornathi was a member of the Corvani High Council who had escaped when their capital world fell to the Dominion. He carried ancient records and cultural artifacts that had been preserved from the earliest days of Corvani civilization, including documents that revealed Ziara's true identity and heritage. Ziara, it turned out, was not just another refugee from the war. She was the daughter of the Resistance's supreme commander and the direct descendant of the Corvani royal family that had ruled peacefully for millennia, before choosing to step down in favor of democratic government. Her bloodline carried ceremonial significance that made her a powerful symbol for Corvani who were fighting to preserve their traditional values against the Dominion's authoritarian rule. This revelation shocked everyone, including Ziara herself. She had known that her family was involved in the resistance leadership, but she had never understood the full extent of her heritage or the expectations that came with it. Elder Kornathi explained that many Corvani had assumed she was dead, and news of her survival would inspire hope throughout the resistance networks. But the discovery of Ziara's royal heritage also created new political complications. Some human officials began to worry that they had been manipulated into an alliance with what was essentially a foreign monarchy. Conservative factions demanded to know why Ziara had concealed her true identity, and whether the Corvani resistance was really the democratic movement it claimed to be. The Corvani refugees, meanwhile, began treating Ziara with a reverence that made her deeply uncomfortable. They expected her to take on leadership responsibilities that she felt unprepared for, especially given her youth and her long separation from Corvani society. The weight of their expectations, combined with the pressure of representing her people in human space, began to take a visible toll on her emotional well-being. Marcus watched with growing concern as Ziara struggled to balance these competing demands. The brilliant, curious child who had studied human technology with such joy was disappearing, replaced by a serious young leader who rarely smiled and spent most of her time in formal meetings and diplomatic ceremonies. He worried that the political responsibilities were crushing the spirit that had made Ziara so special. In the first place, the crisis came when Elder Kornathi and other refugee leaders formally requested that Ziara return to the active war zones to serve as a rallying symbol for the resistance. They argued that her presence would inspire Corvani forces and help unify the fractured resistance movement. The ceremony they proposed would formally recognize her as the heir to the traditional Corvani leadership, giving her authority to speak for all Corvani who oppose the Dominion. Ziara was torn between her sense of duty to her people and her growing attachment to the life she had built in human space. She had found purpose and friendship among humans, and she genuinely enjoyed the scientific research and cultural exchange programs that were flourishing as part of the Alliance. But she also felt guilty about living in safety while her people suffered under Dominion rule. The debate over Ziara's future became a major issue within the Alliance leadership. Some human officials supported her return to the war zones, believing that a unified Corvani resistance would be more effective against the Dominion. Others argued that her diplomatic value was too great to risk, and that she could serve the Alliance better by remaining in human space. Marcus found himself in the unique position of being the only person whose opinion Ziara truly trusted on this deeply personal decision. She had grown up under his protection and guidance, and she still turned to him for advice when facing difficult choices. But this was a decision that went far beyond anything Marcus had ever dealt with, involving the fate of civilizations and the survival of entire species. After weeks of agonizing deliberation, Ziara made her choice. She would accept the ceremonial recognition of her heritage and the leadership role that came with it, but she would use that authority to make the alliance with humanity an official policy of the Corvani resistance. Rather than leaving human space, she would establish a permanent Corvani embassy and serve as the official representative of her people's government in exile. The ceremony held to formalize this decision was unlike anything ever seen in human space. Thousands of Corvani refugees gathered in the main auditorium of the New Geneva Research Complex, along with human officials and Alliance personnel. Elder Cornathi performed the ancient rituals that recognized Ziara as the legitimate heir to Corvani leadership, while she simultaneously signed the formal treaty that made the Human Corvani Alliance a binding commitment between sovereign governments. Marcus stood beside Ziara throughout the ceremony, no longer just her protector and friend, but officially recognized as her diplomatic advisor and cultural liaison. The simple maintenance worker who had saved a dying alien child had become a key figure in interstellar politics, though he still felt completely unprepared for the responsibilities that came with his new role. As Ziara accepted the ceremonial crown that marked her as the leader of the Corvani resistance, Marcus saw both pride and sadness in her violet eyes. She had gained the authority needed to help her people, but she had also accepted a burden that would define the rest of her life. The curious child who had marveled at human music and technology was now a queen in exile, responsible for the survival of an entire civilization. The ceremony ended with a joint declaration from human and Corvani leaders, announcing their unified commitment to defending against the Dominion invasion and establishing a new model for interstellar cooperation. But even as they celebrated this historic achievement, the Dominion invasion fleet arrived exactly 14 months after the first diplomatic contact, emerging from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system with overwhelming force. Long-range sensors detected more than 3,000 vessels of various sizes, from massive dreadnoughts that dwarfed human battleships to swarms of smaller craft that moved like schools of metallic fish through the void. The Allied Defense Coordination Center on Luna had been monitoring deep space for weeks, and the moment the invasion fleet appeared, every human and Corvani facility in the system received the alert. This was the moment that all their preparation had been leading toward, the test that would determine whether the alliance between two very different species could stand against a common enemy. Admiral Sarah Chen, Marcus's distant cousin who had risen to command the Joint Defense Forces, immediately activated the defensive plan that had been months in the making. Human manufacturing centers throughout the system began producing automated defense platforms at maximum capacity, while Corvani shield generators powered up to protect the most critical installations. But the real key to their strategy was something that neither species could have accomplished alone. The Alliance had developed a new type of warfare that combined human tactical flexibility with Corvani technological sophistication. Instead of meeting the Dominion fleet in traditional ship-to-ship combat, they planned to use coordinated swarms of small craft and automated systems to overwhelm the enemy's ability to respond effectively. Ziara had played a crucial role in developing these tactics, using her knowledge of Dominion military doctrine to identify weaknesses that could be exploited. The Dominion relied on hierarchical command structures and overwhelming firepower, assuming that their technological superiority would allow them to dominate any engagement. They weren't prepared for the chaotic, adaptive style of warfare that the Alliance had created. Marcus found himself assigned to the command center as a liaison between human and Corvani tactical teams. His role was supposed to be administrative, helping to coordinate communications and logistics. But as the battle developed, his intimate knowledge of how both species thought and operated made him invaluable for troubleshooting the inevitable problems that arose when two different military traditions tried to work together. The first phase of the battle went exactly according to plan. Dominion scout ships that pushed ahead of the main fleet were engaged by clouds of automated defense drones that attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The scouts had superior weapons and shielding, but they couldn't adapt quickly enough to deal with hundreds of small targets that coordinated their attacks through quantum communication networks. As news of these early victories spread throughout the Alliance forces, Marcus felt a surge of hope that their desperate gamble might actually work. The Dominion had never faced this type of resistance before, and their rigid tactical doctrine was proving to be a liability when confronted with truly innovative opposition. But the Dominion commanders were not fools, and they learned quickly from their initial setbacks. The main fleet began deploying countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize swarm tactics, including area effect weapons that could destroy large numbers of small craft simultaneously. The technological advantage that had seemed so promising suddenly became much less decisive. The second phase of the battle was a grinding war of attrition that lasted for days. Dominion forces pushed steadily toward the inner system, accepting heavy losses in exchange for methodical progress toward their primary targets. Human manufacturing centers and Corvani research facilities came under increasingly intense bombardment as the enemy fleet drew closer to inhabited worlds. Ziara spent these critical days coordinating between the various Corvani resistance cells that had sent ships to join the defense. Her authority as the recognized leader of the resistance was essential for maintaining unity among groups that had been operating independently for years. But Marcus could see the strain of command wearing on her, especially when reports came in of entire Corvani squadrons being destroyed by Dominion weapons. Turning point came when Dominion forces reached the orbit of Mars and began deploying siege engines designed to crack planetary defenses. These massive constructs had been used to subjugate dozens of Corvani worlds, and their presence signaled that the Dominion was preparing for the final phase of conquest. Once the siege engines were fully operational, the Alliance would have no choice but to surrender or watch human worlds be systematically destroyed. That's when Ziara proposed a strategy so dangerous that most of the Alliance leadership initially rejected it as suicidal. She wanted to use a small strike force to penetrate the Dominion fleet and target the command ship directly. If they could eliminate the fleet's central command authority, the rigid Dominion hierarchy would collapse into chaos, giving the Alliance forces an opportunity to counterattack effectively. The plan required volunteers to fly directly into the heart of the enemy fleet, with virtually no chance of survival even if the mission succeeded. The strike force would consist of both human and Corvani vessels, using advanced stealth technology to avoid detection until they were close enough to launch their attack. Ziara insisted on leading the mission personally, arguing that her authority was needed to ensure cooperation between the different resistance groups involved. Marcus was horrified by the idea of Ziara taking such a risk, and he wasn't alone in his opposition. Elder Cornathi and other Corvani leaders argued that losing their symbolic leader would be a devastating blow to resistance morale. Human officials pointed out that Ziara's diplomatic value far exceeded her military contribution, and that her death would damage the Alliance relationship permanently. But Ziara had made up her mind, and her authority as the resistance leader gave her the right to make this decision. She argued that symbolic leadership meant nothing if she wasn't willing to share the same risks as the people she asked to fight and die for the cause. More practically, she was one of the few people who understood Dominion command systems well, enough to identify the right targets once they reached the enemy flagship, the Nalamerani Debate raged for hours while Dominion forces continued their advance toward Earth. Finally, Admiral Chen made the decision that ended the argument. The military situation was desperate enough that any plan with a reasonable chance of success had to be attempted, regardless of the political risks involved. The strike mission would proceed as planned, with Ziara leading a mixed force of human and Corvani volunteers. Marcus knew that he couldn't let Ziara face this mission alone, just as he had known years earlier that he couldn't abandon an injured alien child. Despite having no military training or combat experience, he volunteered to serve as the human representative on the strike team. His presence would demonstrate human commitment to the Alliance and provide Ziara with the emotional support she would need during the most dangerous mission of her life. The strike force assembled at a hidden staging area in the asteroid belt, consisting of 20 small craft equipped with the most advanced stealth systems the Alliance could produce. The ships were fast and maneuverable but lightly armed, relying on speed and surprise rather than firepower to accomplish their mission. Each vessel carried enough explosives to cripple a Dominion capital ship, but only if they could get close enough to deploy them effectively. As the strike force prepared to depart, Marcus had a private moment with Ziara to discuss what they both knew might be their final conversation. She had grown so much since the frightened child he had rescued on Kepler 442b, developing into a leader who inspired loyalty and respect from beings of two different species. But in this quiet moment before the mission, he could still see traces of the curious, brilliant girl who had marveled at human music and technology. Ziara thanked Marcus for everything he had done for her, not just the rescue that had started their relationship, but the years of friendship and guidance that had helped shape her into the person she had become. She also made him promise that if she didn't survive the mission, he would continue working to strengthen the alliance between their peoples. The cooperation they had built was too important to be lost, regardless of what happened to any individual leaders. The strike force launched under cover of a diversionary attack that drew Dominion attention away from their approach vector. As they raced through space toward the enemy fleet, Marcus reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. A simple act of compassion toward an injured alien child had somehow led to him flying a suicide mission to save two civilizations from conquest. But as he looked at Ziara's determined face in the cockpit beside him, Marcus knew that every choice they had made along the way had been worth it. Win or lose, they had proven that different species could work together as equals, creating something greater than either could achieve alone. That example would outlive them both, inspiring future generations to reach for the stars with open hands rather than clenched fists. The Dominion fleet loomed ahead of them, a vast constellation of death and destruction that had already conquered half the galaxy. But it had never faced anything like the alliance between humanity and the Corvani. The strike force penetrated the Dominion fleet's outer perimeter without being detected, their advanced stealth systems masking their approach from enemy sensors. As they moved deeper into the formation, Marcus could see the true scale of the invasion force through his cockpit viewport. Thousands of vessels stretched in every direction, a mobile civilization dedicated entirely to conquest and subjugation. Ziara's voice came through the communication channel, calm and focused despite the enormous risk they were all taking. She had identified the Dominion command ship, a massive dreadnought that bristled with weapons and defensive systems. The vessel was so large that it had its own escort fleet, but those protective ships were also what made it identifiable as the fleet commander's flagship. The plan called for the strike force to split into 3 groups, each approaching the command ship from a different angle to divide the defensive fire. Ziara would lead the primary attack group directly toward the bridge section, while the other teams targeted the ship's engines and communication arrays. If everything went perfectly, they might disable the vessel without destroying it completely, potentially capturing valuable intelligence about Dominion operations. But as they closed to attack range, the mission went wrong in ways that no one had anticipated. The Dominion command ship was not just heavily defended, it was equipped with experimental weapons that had never been seen before. Energy nets erupted from hidden projectors, snaring several of the strike craft and crushing them like insects in a spider's web. Marcus watched in horror as half of their force was eliminated in the first few seconds of the engagement. The survivors pressed forward with desperate courage, but it was clear that they had seriously underestimated the enemy's capabilities. The Dominion had learned from their earlier defeats and had prepared specific countermeasures for exactly this type of attack as Ziara's ship took a direct hit from a plasma cannon that should have vaporized it completely. But the vessel's Corvani shielding held just long enough for her to crash land in the command ship's main hangar bay. Marcus immediately changed course to follow her, abandoning his assigned target to attempt a rescue that was probably impossible. The hangar bay was swarming with Dominion troops by the time Marcus reached it, but Ziara was still alive and fighting. She had armed herself with weapons from her crashed ship and was using her intimate knowledge of Corvani technology to turn the hangar's own systems against the enemy soldiers. But she was vastly outnumbered and couldn't hold her position much longer. Marcus's ship was too damaged to land properly, so he ejected just before it crashed into a stack of supply containers. The impact knocked him unconscious for several crucial minutes, and when he came to, Ziara was nowhere to be seen. The hangar was filled with smoke and debris, and Dominion reinforcements were pouring in from every entrance. Using his maintenance workers' knowledge of ship systems, Marcus made his way through the command vessel's service tunnels, following emergency lighting toward what he hoped was the detention area. If Ziara had been captured alive, that's where the Dominion would take her for interrogation. The thought of what they might do to extract information about the Alliance's capabilities made him move faster despite his injuries. The detention center was guarded but not heavily fortified, since the Dominion hadn't expected anyone to penetrate this deep into their flagship. Marcus used improvised explosives from his equipment pack to breach the outer door, then fought his way through the facility using weapons he had salvaged from fallen Dominion soldiers. He found Ziara in a high-security cell that was designed to contain dangerous prisoners. She had been beaten but was conscious and alert, her violet eyes blazing with defiance despite her circumstances. The cell's locking mechanism was beyond Marcus's technical skills, but Ziara talked him through the process of overriding the security systems using her knowledge of Dominion technology. Their reunion was brief, but emotional. Ziara was amazed that Marcus had risked everything to rescue her, while he was simply relieved that she was still alive. But they both knew that escaping from the command ship would be even more difficult than reaching it had been. The entire vessel was now on high alert, and Dominion forces were systematically searching every section for the infiltrators. That's when Ziara revealed the real reason she had insisted on leading the strike mission personally. Hidden in her equipment was a virus program designed specifically to target Dominion command and control systems. If she could reach the ship's main computer core, she could upload the virus and potentially disable the entire invasion fleet. The crash landing had actually brought her closer to her objective than the original plan would have allowed. The computer core was located in the most heavily defended section of the ship, surrounded by multiple layers of security and automated defense systems. But Ziara's royal bloodline included genetic markers that were recognized by ancient Corvani security protocols, some of which had been incorporated into Dominion technology when they conquered the original Corvani worlds. Making their way to the computer core became a running battle through the ship's corridors, with Dominion troops closing in from every direction. Marcus used his engineering knowledge to create obstacles and diversions, while Ziara employed her understanding of the ship's systems to guide them along the safest possible route. When they finally reached the computer core, Ziara's genetic identification was indeed recognized by the security systems, granting her access to command functions that the Dominion had assumed were safely locked away. But uploading the virus required several minutes of direct interface time, during which she would be completely vulnerable to attack. Marcus positioned himself to guard the entrance to the computer core, knowing that he would have to hold off Dominion reinforcements with limited weapons and ammunition. As Ziara connected to the main system and began the upload process, he could hear enemy troops massing in the corridors outside. This would be their final stand, regardless of whether the mission succeeded or failed. The virus upload proceeded slowly, with Ziara's consciousness partially merged with the ship's computer systems as she guided the program through layers of defensive software. Marcus watched the progress indicators while fighting off increasingly desperate attacks from Dominion soldiers who had realized what was happening. With 30 seconds remaining in the upload, a Dominion commander appeared in the doorway with a weapon aimed directly at Ziara's defenseless form. Marcus threw himself between them without hesitation, taking the energy blast that would have killed her. As he collapsed, He saw the upload completion indicator flash green, signaling that the mission had succeeded. The virus spread through the Dominion fleet's communication networks like wildfire, corrupting navigation systems and disrupting command protocols throughout the invasion force. Ships began colliding with each other as their automated systems failed, while others found themselves unable to target Alliance vessels effectively. The tactical advantage shifted dramatically within minutes, as Alliance forces launched a coordinated counterattack against the confused and disorganized Dominion fleet. Human and Corvani ships that had been retreating steadily for days suddenly found themselves able to engage the enemy on equal terms. Ziara cradled Marcus's injured form as Dominion resistance collapsed around them. He was badly wounded but alive, and she used her remaining technical equipment to stabilize his condition until rescue could arrive. The simple maintenance worker who had saved her life years earlier had now saved not just her but both their civilizations. The battle for Earth's solar system ended within hours, as the Dominion fleet either surrendered or retreated in disorder. The virus had not only disrupted their immediate operations, but had also provided the Alliance with detailed intelligence about Dominion military capabilities and strategic plans. Over the following months, as Marcus recovered from his injuries, the Alliance used this information to launch liberation campaigns throughout the galaxy. The Dominion's reign of terror was finally ending, brought down by the cooperation between two species that had refused to surrender their freedom. 10 years later, Marcus stood in the gardens of the new Corvani capital, watching as Ziara addressed a gathering of human and Corvani dignitaries celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Alliance. She wore the formal robes of a planetary leader, but her violet eyes still held the curiosity and wonder that had marked her as a child. The galaxy had changed dramatically since their first meeting on Kepler 442b. Dozens of worlds that had been enslaved by the Dominion were now free and self-governing. Human and Corvani colonies existed side by side throughout known space, sharing technology and culture in ways that had once seemed impossible. As Ziara concluded her speech and the crowd began to disperse, she approached Marcus with the same shy smile she had worn as a frightened refugee. Despite all her accomplishments and responsibilities, she still thought of him as the person who had given her a second chance at life when she needed it most. They walked together through the gardens, talking about small things and everyday concerns rather than matters of galactic importance. Marcus was now the director of the Alliance Cultural Exchange Program, while ZMPL,